morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We are 27th of June, and in 2024, I'm sorry that Gladys can't join us today. She's busy. Today is actually a rerun of yesterday because we had some technical difficulties. So that's why we're doing it again today. Thank you for all of you who are joining us. Today's lecture from the Tevya series is called Assault, Materialism. It's lecture number 6 of our series 30 of the Women's Learning Group of Spring 2024, 5784. So, Assault Materialism. When Shalom Aleichem published the 6 of his Tevya stories, Jews in Eastern Europe were in dire straits. Violence against Jews was escalating, and pogroms led to a large fleeing refugee population. During this time, 1906 to 1907, Jewish immigration from Russia to New York reached its peak, largely because of these worsening conditions. However, given the number of wealthy refugees coming through town, Tevya's business is booming. The story almost seems to have a happy start, despite its bleak setting, when Tevya meets a wealthy widow and her immature son, Arnold, known as Aronchik. Tevya gives Aronchik a talking to about responsibility. One thing leads to another, and soon enough, Aronchik has come over and fallen in love with Tevya's daughter, Sprinza. Though Tevya knows that this match will not sit well with Aronchik's upper crust family, Arnold takes responsibility for bringing his family around to the marriage and claims that all will be well. But all is not well. As Professor Weiss explains in this lecture, Aronchik and his family are not the sort of Jews Tevya has met before, and they feel no affinity with the poor dairyman. Aronchik's uncle accuses Tevya of seeking financial gain by luring Arnold into falling for Sprinza, and rejects the match. Depressed and rejected, Sprinza makes a tragic decision. She drowns herself. In this lecture, Professor Weiss explores various interpretations of this strange and awful tale, examining explanations that range from the historical to the Freudian. Mark, it's all yours.
Love. Golda, do you love me?
Do I what?
Do you love me?
Do I love you?
Well?
With our daughters getting married and there's trouble in the town, you're upset, you're worn out, go inside, go lie down. Maybe it's indigestion.
No, Golda, I'm asking you a question. Do you love me?
You're a fool.
I know. But do you love me?
Do I love you?
Well?
For 25 years I've washed your clothes, cooked your meals, cleaned your house, given you children, milked your cow. After 25 years, why talk about love right now?
Golda, the first time I met you was on our wedding day. I was scared.
I was shy.
I was nervous.
So was I.
But my father and my mother said we'd learn to love each other. And now I'm asking, Golda, do you love me?
I'm your wife.
I know. But do you love me?
Do I love him?
Well?
For 25 years I've lived with him, fought with him, starved with him, 25 years my bed is his. If that's not love, what is?
Then you love me.
I suppose I do.
And I suppose I love you too. It doesn't change a thing, but even so, after 25 years, it's nice to know.
Coming in the face of national trauma, say hello to the irresponsible young Jew.
Professor Weiss, we're now going to begin your lecture, the 6th lecture in our series on Tevye's daughter Shprinza.
Yes, this is the most painful, I suppose, of all the stories. Painful in the sense of being the most depressed. It starts off as if it might be as cheerful as the first story, because after all, this is a romance which should work out. Tevye is delivering his dairy.
Are you recording?
Yes.
He goes to the big city and he meets a widow who buys his cheese and appreciates him very much. And she happens to have a son who has lost his father. Her husband has died. There's no one to bring up this boy, and he's become something of a rich playboy. And she's not satisfied with that. And so she actually appeals to the dairyman. Maybe you can sort of take him in hand a little bit, someone as responsible as you. And so Tevye likes this prospect, and so he invites Aronchik to come out to the country for a day, maybe bring his friends along, and you will be fed well, and maybe you will become a little bit more responsible. Maybe you will like to be a Jew a little bit more than you seem to be. Maybe I can instill some Jewish values in you. And so Aronchik comes out into the country, and lo and behold, he meets Tevye's daughter, Shprinza, and he is attracted to her, she to him. Everything should work out well. So we look forward to that for a change after all these daughters who have not married so well. From Tevye's point of view, how strange that this then should turn out to be the most tragic story of all. So that's what we're about to see. The story of Shprinza. Every once in a while, the writer Shalom Aleichem came up against a situation that he could not control. When a story called for an ending that he did not want to provide, he occasionally broke through the fiction to let us know that one part of him could not do as the other part of him would have liked. It's very strange, but he lets us know this in the way he concludes or fails to conclude certain stories. So something of this kind seems to have happened at the end of Chava, after Tevye has declared his daughter dead and warned the family never to mention her name. We usually begin a lecture by quoting from the beginning of our episode. But this time I'd like to return to the conclusion of the previous episode, Chava, to see where we left Tevye the last time. He is telling Mr. Shalom Aleichem, his faithful listener, how he refused to stop for his daughter in the woods. He begins to say the afternoon prayers. The louder he prayed, the more everything in him cried, Chava. But he continued praying anyway, and later never told a soul about the meeting with Chava, though he found out where she and her husband lived. Just let anyone try to worm it out of me, though. My enemies won't live to see the day that I complain. That's the sort of man that Tevye is. Still, I'd give a great deal to know if everyone is like me, or if I'm the only madman of my kind. Once, for example, but do you promise not to laugh at me? Because I'm afraid you'll laugh. Well, once I put on my best clothes and went to the station in order to take the train there. I mean, to where he and she lived. I stepped up to the window and asked for a ticket. Where to? Says the ticket seller. To Yehupitz, I say. Yehupitz, he says? I never heard of such a place. Well, it's no fault of mine if you haven't, I say, and I turn right around, walk home again, take off my best clothes, and go back to work, to my little dairy business with its horse and wagon. How does the saying go? Ish lefalo ve'adam lavodasoy. The tailor to his needle and the shoemaker to his bench. Ah, you're laughing at me anyway? What did I tell you? I even know just what you're thinking. You're thinking what a screwball Tevye is. If you ask me then, Ad kan oimrim b'Shabbos hagodol. It's time to call it quits for the day. Be healthy and well and drop me a line now and then. For God's sake, though, remember what I told you. You are not to breathe a word about this or put it in any of your books. And if you absolutely must write about it, write that it happened to someone else, not to me. As it says in the Bible, Vayishkachehu, me, Tevye the dairyman, please forget. There's so much here. You'll barely scratch the surface of it. But Vayishkachehu, right, and he forgot him, is from the dramatic point in the story of Joseph when he is in prison under Pharaoh. Joseph has proven himself an uncanny interpreter of dreams, but when the time comes that the chief butler should have brought Joseph to the attention of Pharaoh, the Bible tells us, yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, he forgot him. Widely used in Yiddish speech when you want to say that the good you did someone has been forgotten. It's used here by Tevye asking to be forgotten, as though the shame of this episode deserves to be laughed at, laughed off, not in any cathartic way like the line about the cholera epidemic in Odessa, but just plain erased from the story of Tevye altogether. Sholem Aleichem does something we would call very modern here by breaking into the realism that he's worked so hard to establish, to remind us that we are in a work of fiction, right? Tevye asks to be forgotten. Sholem Aleichem does something different but analogous when he reminds us that there is no real Yehupitz, and thus no real story like the one he is telling. When their literary partnership began, Tevye hoped that the publicity would bring him customers. Now, once again, he is ashamed for what is happening in his life. He knows that this story has brought him just the opposite. Having held firm against Chava, Tevye has gone against the softer part of his nature, and he wants to get out of the fiction in which he figures. The author is in the same place. He too has done something which is uncharacteristic for him. Nonetheless, as we see, Sholem Aleichem published this story after all, because when you are in the business of writing, you continue writing. When you are in the business of being a dairyman, you return to being a dairyman. And when you are in the business of being a Jew, you go on being a Jew. So much still to spin out in that, but you see that the main point here that everybody struggles with is that Sholem Aleichem tips his hand. Tevye, in effect, is telling us that this did not happen really, that there is no Yehupitz, and that he was chasing after something went awry, and wants deeply to draw our attention to the fact that I don't know how to pull this out of the hat. Something like that. So a year and a half later, in 1907, Tevye is back again, and in part because bad times for the Jews had made it a boom time in modern Jewish culture. and in the development of both Yiddish and Hebrew literatures. Yiddish daily newspapers were vying for Shalom Aleichem stories, and isn't this interesting? This corresponds to Tevye's observation at the beginning of the Sprinze story that for all the national crises, his dairy business was booming. Have we ever had a summer season here? They've come flocking to Boiberik from Odessa, from Rostov, from Yekaterinoslav, from Mogilev, from Kishinev, thousands of Jews. It seems that the Constitution is even worse where they are because they haven't stopped running in this direction. So for both Shalom Aleichem, the Yiddish writer, and Tevye, the rural dairyman, who depends on these fleeing customers, the frantic Jews of Russia drive up their business. So in making the transition from Chava to Sprinze, we've passed the halfway mark in these stories, and so maybe it's time to take stock of how the fourth daughter fits into the design of the whole. And since this story cycle was being written, let me emphasize still again, in actual time, in actual history, to see where this episode stands in the life of the author and in the history of the Jews. As we've said, every episode in the life of Tevye corresponds to what is happening in the Ukrainian district around Kiev, the fictional Yehupitz, and reflects the mood of Shalom Aleichem, who invests more of himself into Tevye than into any of his other characters. It was a grim time all around. Violence against the Jews was escalating in Russia. Jews were fleeing in dramatic numbers, with over 250,000, mostly Russian Jews, arriving in New York during the peak years, 1881 to 1914. But the peak years here were 1906 and 1907, which is when these really almost 250,000 Jews arrived in those 2 years alone. What you and I and Jews everywhere haven't been through these past years, says Tevye to Mr. Shalom Aleichem when he catches up with him again. Pogroms, riots, troubles, the new Constitution. Dear Lord, it doesn't stop. The muddled way in which Tevye sums up the troubles doesn't do justice to historical events that included Russia's defeat in the 1904 war with Japan, the epidemic of anti-Jewish violence that keeps escalating between 1903 and 1921, the uprising of 1905, and the subsequent granting of the Russian Constitution that was supposed to limit the Tsar's autocratic rule and introduce some civic rights, the Tsar's immediate nullification of most of what the Constitution demanded, ushering in a period of national dejection, one could say. As usual, when Tevye mangles the word Constitution, we can't be sure whether this is a mistake that betrays his ignorance or whether he is expressing his verdict on its corrupting outcome. Tevye won't even deign to use the word properly. So we really never know which it is. Is he tripping up on this word, or is he making fun of it? Because in fact, the Constitution has become not even worth the paper on which it was written. So during the pogrom in Kiev in October 1905, before this story was written, Shalom Aleichem and his family had sought refuge in a local hotel while their Christian housekeeper protected their apartment from attackers. Shalom Aleichem wrote from their hotel in one of his letters, on the 17th, we were granted the gift of the Constitution, gift in quotation marks, in the cause of which our brothers had shed their blood like water. And the same day, about 6 o'clock in the evening, the word went out to beat up the Jews, and attacks came at them from every side. He describes how hopeful they were when they caught sight of the police and the Cossack soldiers in the streets below, only to realize that they had come to protect the attackers, not the Jews. Shalom Aleichem and his family left Russia almost immediately afterward in 1906. The story of Sprinze was written abroad. When Tevye interprets the Bible's repetitive description of the children of Israel's moving from one place to another, camping and journeying, vayisu, vayachanu, vayachanu, vayisu, to mean, if you're running to hide in my place, I'd better go hide in yours. He was speaking for Sholem Aleichem, who never found a permanent home again. Tevye's deteriorating situation in these stories corresponds then also to the worsening conditions of the Jews of Russia and to the disruptions in the life of the author. Now, deterioration is represented through the stories of the daughters, and we might have thought that it peaked in the adventure of Chava. In the previous 3 stories, Tevye tells of the threats to his way of life that came in the form of suitors who introduce values different from or antithetical to his. You remember, Motel the tailor spouts a respect for manual labor that undercuts the Jewish emphasis on learning and overturns the hierarchical system of yichus, inherited family standing. His challenge is very mild compared to Perchik's revolutionary zeal in the name of the communist future. And Chvedka, the second Gorky, stands for the non-denominational society that transcends religious categories. All 3 make their way past Tevye's defenses under the banner of love as the determinant of the daughters' marriages. Love may be merely the vehicle through which these values and ideals compete with Judaism, but functionally, practically, as we've seen, if love dictates marital choice over and above the community, no people can survive. As we've said, this is equally true for all other religious and ethnic groups. But as the archetypal diaspora society and a dedicated minority among much more populous nations, Jews face this challenge of love, romantic love, as the determinant of choice most acutely. So it's kind of, romantic love is kind of the fire-breathing dragon, and true love romance is the fire itself. Now, how did Sholem Aleichem and Tevye feel about romantic love? Tevye seems very proud of this capacity in each of his daughters. He writes, "I know my girls. Didn't I once tell you that when Tevye's daughters, God help us, fall for someone, they fall with everything they have? And except in the case of Chava, when this puts his daughters at odds with him, he yields to their preference over some son-in-law that he may have for the moment preferred." So Sprinze ought to have been a happy summer tale, just like the opening story of Tevye's Lucky Break. Here, once again, the poor country Jew meets the wealthy Jew from the city, and their transaction is mutually beneficial. Delivering his dairy products to the wealthy vacationers, Tevye gets to know one of his customers, a widow with an only son who needs someone to take him in tow. Each party provides some service or advantage to the other, and thereby demonstrates that the economic chasm between them is no impediment to mutual self-help or mutual help as members of the same Jewish people. How often does it happen in a story that a young man and woman fall in love with the right person, right? With the person who satisfies more or less the community's idea of an appropriate match. One can't blame Tevye for rejoicing at the prospect of having this quiet daughter marry the man she loves, who will at the same time bring him, Tevye, the security that he's always craved and a chance to sit and study Torah, his long postponed ambition. And so I told myself, you fool you, why must you always think you know best? Why can't you admit the whole thing may be providential? Why isn't it possible that quiet little Sprinze is meant to be your salvation, your reward for all the hardship and heartache, which is this time considerable, so that at last you can enjoy yourself in your old age and live like a human being for once? Suppose your daughter is fated to be a millionairess. Is that really so terrible? Is that such a blow to your dignity? So the reader might even put Tevye's question another way. After so many stories of loss, can Shalom Aleichem give us just one more happy ending? Here we seem to be so close to a happy summer romance. The widow's son, Aronchik, could really use a father figure who would try to rein him in, toughen him up, and make him assume some responsibility. That's what the widow asks of Tevye, after all, when she complains to him that although Aronchik was over 20 years old, all he cared about was horses, fishing, and bicycles. Presumably, Tevye, with his hard-won experience and disciplined work ethic, could be a good influence. He could also draw Aronchik closer to his Jewishness. Kiruv is the term Orthodox Jews use for outreach to non-Orthodox Jews to draw them closer to Jewishness and encourage them to live according to Jewish law. So Tevye is practicing Kiruv when he invites Aronchik to come with his friends to spend the holiday of Shavuot at his farm, and good psychologist that he is, he does not reprimand the young Jews when they arrive on horseback instead of walking there on a holiday. He introduces them to Jewish observance in the form of delicious Jewish food, just as Chabad does when it uses hospitality in this directed way. Now, let me just say here that the reference to Chabad is anything but random, because when Uncle says, "I'm told they call you Tevye," our man replies that they do indeed. And here we have the first and only hint of such a thing. Tevye says, "And when they call me to the Torah in the synagogue, it's even Reb Tevye, the son of Shneir Zalman." Now, Shneir Zalman of Liadi was the founder of Chabad, and those identified with Chabad often carry these names. So here we really have a clue of exactly who Tevye is and where he stands within, the Jewish family. So why couldn't Shalom Aleichem just this once give us a true love romance where everyone is reconciled to the union of Shprinze and Aronchik? Tevye wants it desperately, and he feels if God were just, if good things happened to good people, he would be blessed with at least one Cinderella daughter. We can't know what was in the author's mind, but I think we realize why this simple story could not have a happy outcome. Times have changed, and Jews have changed over time. In 1895, the rich Jew of Yehupitz, renting a dacha in Boiberik, was still wearing a skull cap, still speaking a juicy Yiddish, still imbued with the same values as the logger who went out of his way to bring home his wife and daughter. That Jew doesn't allow his children to make fun of this simple man. He doesn't take advantage of Tevye's poverty. The still observant rich man knows that in the Jewish tradition, more is required of the wealthy than of the poor. Generosity, consideration, refinement that is expressed in their attitude to people. He considers himself the custodian of his wealth rather than its privileged owner. Now, the resemblance between Tevye's opening story and this one a dozen years later illumines the contrast between the rich Yehupitz Jews then and the present family from Yekaterinoslav. The coarsening of Jews in the process of assimilation is reflected in the uncle who confronts Tevye in this story. He has come to get his nephew out of what he considers an unfortunate scrape with some poor country girl. He sends for Tevye and wants to get straight down to business. And there is, of course, the inevitable miscommunication over the word affair. In Yiddish, chasene, which is used the same way to mean sort of a happening, which Tevye thinks refers to the wedding, but the uncle thinks of as entrapment. And the uncle minces no words. Either you're playing dumb or you really are dumb. Only how dumb can you be to have set my nephew up in the first place by pretending to invite him over for blintzes in order to introduce him to a young beauty who may or may not be your daughter? Now, it was, of course, Tevye who warned Aronchik that his daughter was not a suitable match for him. But Arnold, nay Aronczyk, waved this off, pretending to take command of his life without the strength of character to deliver on his promises. The uncle has it backwards. It was his nephew who exploited the encounter with the dairyman, and who now stands accused of having exploited the nephew. Yet in the typical plot of romance, the father could have been functioning in the role of a procurer. Does Tevye's subconscious implicate him in this tragedy? In other words, does he blame himself for really having brought this about? Does the romance itself, with the assumptions and expectations of romantic fiction, bear some responsibility for undermining the traditional Jewish way of life? After all, if Sholem Aleichem himself is bringing us romances, is that in some way functioning like the dairyman in bringing this match about that he is half hopeful about? So this is the second consecutive story that emphasizes Tevye's humiliation, this time not at the hands of a priest, of a Gentile, but at the hands of someone who is for the time being still a fellow Jew. Worsening conditions include the assimilation of those Jews who have been living in the larger cities and trying to distance themselves from their religious observance, from the Yiddish language, and from any national obligations. Betrayal now comes in the form of Arnold, who behaves really in this story, just like the young sons of Polish landowners in stories of seduction in Yiddish literature, who think that they can carry off the Jewish girl with impunity since her father lacks the power to stop them. Tevye's helplessness at the uncle's insulting treatment of him reduces him to silence and to tears. I cried and cried until I had no tears left. Now, usually at such a point, Tevye would say, but Tevye is no woman, and pull himself together. This time, his daughter is the casualty of a crisis in which he is not entirely blameless, and his inability to protect her and her reputation and to secure her happiness unmans him as nothing has done so far. Now, once the Tevye stories became for Sholem Aleichem a way of confronting the trials of the Jews, this romance could not end happily. The trust in romance is never reliable, and the fantasy that Tevye allows himself to spin around this love affair is as misguided as his trust in Menachem Mendel's stock market schemes. Love, in this sense, is as impractical as speculation. Jewish literature was attracted by true love adventures as one of the trends in Western culture. Tevye and Sholem Aleichem are both tempted to believe in romance as the guide to marriage, one as the soft-hearted parent, the other as the writer who wants to produce marketable stories. But this story warns us that romance spins a web of hope where none is warranted, and Jews cannot afford that diversion. So Tevye's kiruv, predicated on the assumption of national solidarity, was as chimerical as Sprinc's expectation of love. Tevye is implicated in this tragedy, I think, because his own fairy tale wish for wealth is the counterpart of Sprinc's falling in love in this way. To tell you the honest truth, if I wanted that match at all, it was less for the match's sake than for the feeling of satisfaction it would give me. The devil take you all, I'd be able to say to all the rich Jews of Yehupitz. Until now, it's been nothing but Brodsky, 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 but now you see who Tevye really is. So behind this, I think we understand that the political powerlessness of the Jew, which Tevye is feeling more and more, makes wealth the only lever of even partially autonomy. And that Brodsky, the rich Jew, the sugar magnate, represents, among other things, the right to reside in Yehupitz, the right to be taken seriously as a person, yet Tevye is imprudent to indulge this daydream. He warns his daughter, but a little too late, and he challenges Aronczyk, but a little too gently. His ambivalence and his own daydreams seem to blind him to the impending tragedy. And it's here in this chapter that Tevye compares himself to Job, the good man who suffers unjust punishment. At the end, he seems almost incapable of the resiliency that we've come to rely on because there is actually less basis for hope. Tevye's political helplessness and economic hardships are by now so compounded by the realization that the switch from Aronchik to Arnold signifies, believe it or not, a more serious rift than any of the things that came before, more serious even than Chava's attraction to a post-denominational illusion. At a time when Jews were being threatened as a people, assimilation was pulling the nation farther apart. Trying to shore up his family and bring Jews together, Tevye discovers a new menace in the combination of Aronchik's immaturity and his uncle's cynicism, which is the double face of the acculturating Jew. Tevye was never taken in by the priest, and he was never taken in by Chvedka, but he is taken in by this young man who turns out to act as a charlatan. He cannot protect his daughter in either case, but in this case, he feels that he shoulders a little of the blame. Now, silent Sprinza, she remains a mystery. We know too little of her to grieve for her. Am I mistaken? And at the end of this story, one doesn't feel the heartache that one feels in the earlier two stories. We hardly know her at all. At best, we share Tevye's grief at losing a child. In fact, we know so little about her that some critics fill in the blank by suggesting that she must have been pregnant, which is a literary trope in this kind of plot, and it provides some readers with a stronger rationale for her suicide. So the literary critic Dan Miron writes quite definitively, Sprinze, here I quote him, realizing that she is about to bring shame on the heads of her parents, starts her downward slide toward lethal depression that will end in her self-destruction. By refusing to talk to her, Tevye reinforces her sense that her out-of-wedlock pregnancy is unacceptable. Now, this applies to Sprinze, the assumptions that are borrowed from other similar works of fiction, right? Actually, Tevye does try to alert both her and Aronchik to the risks that they are taking. And as for the pregnancy, I've looked in vain for any such real hint in the story. Sprinze is at an age when people feel things intensely, and her submerged emotions at having been so cruelly dumped and humiliated in a community from which she cannot escape is persuasive enough as a cause of death. There is no implied pregnancy that I know of in Romeo and Juliet, and they commit suicide. Sholem Aleichem wrote other stories about two girls who commit suicide because it was in fashion at that time of national depression. So Sprinze may have taken her life as jilted teenagers unfortunately sometimes do. But everyone is left, you see, with a huge act of interpretation if Sprinze is your focus here. Because in fact, she does sink into a fatal depression, but the causes of it are not spelled out. Now, some readers are so uncomfortable with Tevye's telling of this story that they probe deeper. Janet Hadda was a Yiddish scholar and a trained psychoanalyst who, although she expresses due caution at treating a literary text as a living person, subjected Tevye's narrative, which she says is reminiscent of psychoanalytic free association, she submits it to the same scrutiny that she used in her treatment of patients. Though Sprinze is the victim, Tevye, the speaker, is the subject of her analysis. So Hadda suggests that Sprinze's idea of committing suicide while certainly not directly suggested to her by her father, is nonetheless made available to her by Tevye's unusually frequent references to death in general and to suicide in particular. She picks up all Tevye's idioms, like lying 6 feet underground for being downcast, slaughtering someone without a knife for gratuitous insult. And although these are common Jewish expressions, Hadda believes that they are part of the subtext of the story's inclination toward death. And we can remember now, retroactively, you remember that when he sees his daughter Hodel, and she says, "I will never see you again," his first thought is suicide and drowning. It couldn't possibly have occurred to us seriously at the time, but now when we see this, we really see that such thoughts are on his mind. So in the passage from Chava that I trace to Jeremiah, where Tevye compares himself to a tree in the forest, Hadda pays attention not to the still-standing oak, but to the Tevye's question whether there is any point to a naked tree with its lopped-off branches. It would be better to chop the tree down completely and let that be an end to it, he says. So everyone notes the fluctuation that forms Tevye's personality, but Hadda thinks his expressed ambivalence, for example, to being a man and to the hardship of raising daughters, and his unsatisfied hunger for self-respect and such things are so great that they play a role in the suicide of his daughter, who, quote, fulfills her father's unconscious wish for her by taking her life. And she writes, "In the end, the suicide of Sprinze is more than the lonely decision of a desperate young woman, though it is that as well." Now, Hadda's psychoanalysis of Tevye tips the balance from the side of health to the side of illness, teasing out what leads to suicide in Sprinze rather than, as we have been doing, what reaffirms Tevye's moral and psychological balance. Whatever one thinks of this method and of her conclusions, they offer us several important insights, including the reminder that Sholem Aleichem and Sigmund Freud were contemporaries. Freud knew that great writers intuitively understood much of what he tried to prove through controlled investigation. And Sholem Aleichem was well aware that the humor he used to comfort his people was there to surmount an undertow of depression, often including his own. The undertow that pulls Sprinze to her death is present not only in Tevye, but in Yiddish folk culture, from which he draws some of his best lines. Now, both these men, Sholem Aleichem and Freud, were the result of a richly dialectic tradition, the intellectual opposition in Talmudic discussion having its emotional parallel and psychological equivalent in the Jewish balancing act that was always necessary between realism and faith, between what was actually happening to them and what they were committed to believing they would be their just desert if only they continued to be good Jews. So in his work on jokes and their relation to the unconscious, Sigmund Freud says much that is relevant to Sholem Aleichem's humor, and one of his insights bears on this story. It is our belief that civilization and higher education have a large influence in the development of repression. And we suppose that under such conditions, the psychical organization undergoes an alteration that can also emerge as an inherited disposition, as a result of which what was formerly felt as agreeable now seems unacceptable and is rejected with all possible psychical force. So he is talking here about this repressive activity of civilization, brings it about that possibilities of enjoyment that we have had to censor in ourselves are lost to us. This is a huge part of Freud's concern, that, at our simpler stages of development, we had, especially erotic kinds of pleasure, much more in free-floating forms of pleasure. And the more civilized we are, the more repressed we are, and therefore we have to give up these sources of pleasure. And who knew it better than a European Jew, right? So he writes, to the human psyche, all renunciation is exceedingly difficult. And he suggests that joking is a means of undoing this renunciation, the repression, and retrieving something that was lost. In other words, joking is a form of pleasure, and it's a special form of pleasure to those who practice repression. And Jewish joking, which is so intellectually keen, so much like Tevye's, right, is the pleasure principle of people who are to such a degree repressed. Right? This offers a terrific explanation for Jewish humor and the humor of a people that adheres to a high level of civilization, and a people that is often forced to hold back because it cannot allow itself to aggress against those who do it harm. So this also offers a good explanation for Tevye's compulsive quoting, which is often a form of joking. Telling stories may be Tevye's talking cure, which is how one of Freud's patients referred to psychoanalysis. But his account of what happened to Sprinze is almost too depressed for his customary humor. If Chava ends in this escape to fantasy, this story ends no less curiously in the opposite way, with an insistence on open-eyed realism without any verbal pyrotechnics. What was it I wanted to ask you? Oh, yes. Have you ever seen a drowned man? Never? Well, mostly one dies with one's eyes shut, but a drowned man's eyes are always open. I just thought you might know why that was. Of course, the immediate reference is to Sprinze, right? But it is also to him. He is drowning with his eyes wide open, is he not? And this story is, in that sense, extremely strange, because the one thing that we have not seen Tevye, if we have not seen him say no in the previous story for the first time, he says no. Here, for the first time, he is the one who ends, no cholera epidemic in Odessa. No, have you ever seen somebody drowned with his eyes wide open? He has to look with his eyes wide open unerringly in order to see that person with eyes wide open. So Tevye's stories are not a talking cure in a sense. They're not looking for a cure. They are the cure. They are meant to be the cure for the incurable condition of Jewish life in desperate times, which is what this was. The depressed mood of this story invites a lot of thought about the historical moment, the author's situation, the evolution of Tevye, the function of the literary romance, and all the themes that this story touches on. But more than Tevye's psyche, let's not forget one of the things in this story, right? It's Arnold's cowardly betrayal that is the immediate cause of Sprinze's suicide. So coming in the face of national trauma, say hello to the irresponsible young Jew.
This is a way to read the story as a judgment against the materialism that's now so enticing to the Jewish community that it in fact undermines the idea of Jewish community.
This is exactly right. And if you notice that there is a kind of ism behind every one of these stories, if one wanted to put it in those terms: positivism, communism, universalism. And in this case, I would say that Sholem Aleichem, in some sense, sees this as being even worse in terms of the problem that it presents. Conversion, for all that, is clear-cut. Materialism he sees as being far more damaging to the prospects of a continuing Jewish people. And here's the first point in this story of Sprinze where we see that.
Oh, I'm gonna let you unmute. No worries. I know. I'm gonna let you unmute. Ask to unmute. There you go. On your phone as well. There you go. There you
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. Wow, there, like she says, there's so much there. And I
There it
could
is.
only imagine Gigi's mind racing at 500 miles an hour and how she's going to pack all of this into one summary. But she does it so brilliantly. I'm so looking forward to reading her again for this sixth lesson. I just wanted to share something from Rabbi Friedman, who says love and money are killing marriages, because when you marry for love, it's like you want something from that person, the love. And like, forget about who they are. They have opinions, they have feelings. Doesn't matter. All you want from them is the love. He says, well, if you want that, go back to your mother. Because love is just, a feeling. One day you may love somebody, next minute you can hate them for what they did, but that moves on, and life moves on, and you go back to appreciating who they are and what they do and who they are to you. But if you marry for love, it's almost as bad as marrying for materialism. And so I find it so interesting that Ruth Weiss sees materialism as a greater threat to Jewish continuity, even than conversion. Because as we see in the end of the series, the girl who converted, Chava, she wants to come back. When she sees that the Jews are being kicked out of their villages, she says, look, I mean, I cannot not join my family. I cannot remain where I am and watch my people go. So she comes back to the fold. But here we see that materialism completely it dilutes everything that the community and their faith is trying to keep into one piece. So all of that dissolves. How are you going to put it back together? And that's why this poor girl committed suicide. She saw everything as either black or white. She didn't even, it completely destroyed all her faith in life. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Everyone can unmute themselves.
Sandra, it's Barbara speaking. This was so powerful. I think we need time to absorb it a bit, really. Thank you so much for hosting today and doing this for us. I know not everyone could come. I know, we're really time constricted, but really, I think this was one of the best interpretations, and I want to read now. I want to study more. It's
absolutely.
it so
That's why it's so important that we are doing a rerun of this, because yesterday's technical difficulties prevented us. But you're going to receive a set of all of Gigi's summaries in one shot. And on top of each summary at the top will be the link to the recording of each session. That's why it was so important to have this one too. And
Yes.
then you can go back in, sit in an armchair with a cup of tea and review it. I've seen some of these films 2 or 3 times, and each time I see it, I get more that I may have missed the last time.
Yes, true.
If I could chime in, and Gigi's raised her hand. I'm sorry. Gigi, you want to go before me? Go ahead.
I think you said Gigi, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So there were 2 comments that I wanted to make. One is that I can't remember which very, very prominent rabbi said that the most challenging obstacle to Jewish survival, the survival of the Jewish people, is America, because it offers freedoms. So there's, the temptation to follow all sorts of isms, right? Anyway, if he has, that particular rabbi has been proven partially right about what, 76%, 73%, I don't know, but it's in the 70s percent of Western Jews intermarry. How many of them have anything Jewish in the home, or continue to give their Jewish identity onto their children? We don't know. Very, very few. It's probably a minority. We constantly hear of Jews saying, American Jews saying, I'm of Jewish descent. They're not looking to the future to say, I'm Jewish, which means I'm passing it on. No, I'm of Jewish descent. It's almost as if that's the end of the line. My kids will choose whatever they want out of ignorance. Okay, so that is one. And thank God there is a spiritual movement, even in Israel. And many secular Jews are finding their way back. Unfortunately, some of them are tempted by the evangelists to go into Christianity. It's really sad because they don't know anything about Judaism. The other thing that I wanted to say is that when that particular critic talks about Tevye wanting his daughter dead and using all sorts of analogies and allusions and whatever, and consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously communicating his death wish to her, I think that there's something we've got to moderate that. And that is to say that, sometimes something bad happens and we say, oh God, I wish I could just, get rid of it. I want to banish it. I want to destroy it, etc. It's a phase. It's a reaction to it. It doesn't mean that you really, really want it for the long term. You don't want your daughter to die. You don't want to kill her, but you want that episode to die. You want to destroy that episode. So I think he did think along those terms, and he did say them, and she perhaps interpreted it as, that's it. I'm depressed and I was humiliated, and I'm going to bring more humiliation to my family, and my father doesn't even want me. Perhaps she did get that message. I don't think he really meant it, not truly. If you had asked him, do you want your daughter dead, he would definitely
and she reminds us about when Hodel tells him that you're never going to see me again because she's going to go to Siberia. The first thought that came to his mind, he says, was, oh, she's going to kill herself. And then she explained, no, I'm going to follow him to Siberia and all of that. So it kind of was a spillover from all the pain that he's already experienced. And here again, another daughter and another challenge. And to your point, Gigi, how interesting that our next lecture is going to be entitled America, the False Hope. And in fact, at this time, Yeah, the false hope. In fact, at this time, as she said in this lecture, he wrote this when he was in America. This story he wrote when they fled. 250,000 Jews from Russia had fled at this time, 1906 to 1907, to New York. And yeah, go on. Sorry.
The great poet, I always get his name mangled. It's Sutzkever, something like this. He was so great that Stalin sent in a little plane into the ghetto or the forest where he was hiding to get this man and his wife and child out of Poland, and the plane had an accident, burst into flames. He sent it, and then the pilot died. He sent another plane in to get this man out, to save him, because he thought that this man was such a great poet. Anyway, Sutzkever did not go to America. Where did most of the great poets and Yiddish poets and writers and academics go? They went to America, because going to America gave them a chance. Going to Israel meant, the country's just developing. It's too difficult. Sutzkever said, no, I'm going to Israel. And it meant that he wouldn't have the support system, because Yiddish was being denigrated in Israel. And I think it was such a great statement that he made. It was a personal sacrifice. It was a great statement to the Jewish people.
And it's the same statement that Tevye does.
Yes,
Tevye
yes.
says, don't count on me. I'm not going to America.
Yes, exactly.
And that's what Lech Lecho, the very last lecture, will be all about. It's such a beautiful description of what is going on in our world today. I mean, the materialism that has gotten to the head of so many people, not only the young, but all the left. Most of the lefties, they're the wealthiest people around. It's almost like they have chosen to throw God out the window. And just like Dennis Prager says, when you do that, you've thrown wisdom out the window. And then it's a free-for-all. There's nothing to bind us all together as moral beings. So, Mark, thank you so much for your time. I guess it's now time to stop the recording, and then we can continue. Those who want to stay on. Farla, wait, Mark, I want Farla's opinion, because that means a lot to us.
Go ahead.
Farla, do you have any thoughts? And then we will stop the recording.
What I'm marveling at is both of you having these discussions really brings a lot to this lecture, I have to say. And my little addition is that when I think of my family, which is a sampling of what's going on in this world today, we brought them up in Jewish schools. We were conservative Jews in our home, and they married, the ones who were married Jews, but they don't really appreciate fully the idea of being Jewish, what it really means. And I don't know, we sort of messed up there with our kids. They're wonderful kids, they're Jewish, but they don't really live a Jewish life. They belong to a synagogue, but they don't go. And they deny a lot of things. They observe some of the holidays, but the way they observe it is a bit of a joke. And I sit there and I look and I say, like, what happened with our upbringing? Because my husband and I really loved being Jewish and study Judaism and take courses and lectures and this and that, and belong to our synagogue and we're active in the synagogue and always searching for that answer. And the kids, except for my daughter, I have to say she's Orthodox, but most kids today, this is how they live.
Your quandary, I came to an answer to that question a few years ago. And I was speaking with Ariella Kotler, and we all know she's an educator. And I told her, when my daughter was like in first grade, we were learning how to read together. And, so she said I was told for homework to read this and know how to read this out loud. So she's reading finally. I think she was in second grade. And I wanted to stop her, every like 10 words when there was a mispronunciation or something to correct, just to alert her, this should be said this way. She said, no, let me continue. And then it was like, so I could see it was so programmed. And I said, what is this? So I was telling Ariella this. She said, they told them, like this is way back in 1992 or 3. They were taught that, it's going to be a new era where, things are going to be online and they're going to have to read things from a phone, so we have to educate them to not to stop, just to go fast. And that was what the government was telling the schools, to follow this norm, and they had to follow it. And she says, that's why your daughter said, no, it's like she knew better than me. Oh, I have to go to the end. I found that so weird. I mean, when I was little, if someone stopped me, I would say, okay. And then I would learn, I would, internalize, and then I'd move to the next word, next phrase, next sentence. So she told me that's exactly deliberate. So in the same way, by osmosis, our kids, and not only yours, all of our kids, have been programmed in this way. And it's the system.
I think it's a question of being exposed. Like you say, go to America. You go to America, everything opens up for you. You've got all kinds of influences, and you are not in one little shtetl like they were. And this was.
And you don't have to be in a shtetl. You can go to a Chabad school or an Orthodox school or a Jewish school. There you get your values. But it's not enough. It has to start at home. It's not enough.
Yeah, it has to start at home. It has to be in school. The point I'm making is that we should be teaching our kids the value and the beauty of the religion, and to make them understand and want to continue. That's the bottom line.
Amazing.
How many? I remember my son coming home after graduating from Herzliya. He went to McGill and he came home and he said he joined a fraternity. Well, we figured it was a Jewish fraternity. No, it wasn't. So like we were a little stunned, but we said, well, how come you did it? He wanted to see how the other world lived. He said, wanted to open up his eyes.
And in this story, she talks about Yehupitz. At the time in Russia, the Jews were put in what's called the Pale of the settlement. They weren't allowed to leave that area. However, there was a law that the wealthy Jews, the ones who could do commerce and had a lot to share with the country in terms of commerce, they were allowed to live in the big cities. So when the big persecutions were happening in this lecture, that's when they were kicked out also of those big cities. And you have a rush of wealthy Jews coming down to the areas where Tevye lived, and his business was booming because they were buying his dairy products. But that was also the time when it was the worst time for the Jews, and they were fleeing to America. So you've got these people like the uncle. They were so disconnected from their Judaism. They really bought into that materialism and wanting to assimilate, to ingratiate themselves to the host country. And that, Abraham would be crawling in his grave, our archfather Abraham, because he's the one who rejected all of that. And yet he was rich and powerful, but he stuck to his faith. And if we ever my feeling is, if we ever feel lured into the luster and glamour of the prevailing culture, into the materialism that is so glitzy, that is so enticing, we can always hook on to our archfather Abraham and see him as a model. You don't have to give up your wealth. You don't have to give up your dreams and your desires to be Jewish. On the contrary, it is very much encouraged to work hard and amass wealth, because only then can you help your other Jews, like the more wealthy Jew helped Tevye in the first story, that the wealthy Jews feel responsible to help the more vulnerable, the widow and the orphan. So,
well, the challenge to continue your values as a Jew, to live, and you can live as a Jew and a rich, can follow the rich heritage and still be part of another culture, living in another culture like we do here. The problem is this whole anti-Semitism side of it creates an added problem, an added challenge. But anyway,
so we're so grateful for all of you who are participating. We love your comments. They're being recorded, and thank you. We look forward to the next lecture, which will be called America, the False Hope. And so, Mark, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for your precious time.
It's my pleasure. This was a very enjoyable session. I'm reflecting and absorbing a lot of what was being said.
Yeah.
And
God bless you.
Thank you. So it was enjoyable. All right. So